In Genesis chapter 18, it starts off right away with the Lord appeared again to Abraham. This happens as Abraham is sitting at the opening of his tent and he looks out and sees three men standing nearby. Verse 2 says, when he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. There are several theories to who these three visitors were, and we won't get into all of that, but the most widely accepted thought is that the two of them are angels, and one is thought to be God himself, veiled in human form, from just how the text reads. In verse 10, we see God promising once again a son to Abraham and Sarah. As we've been reading through Genesis since about chapter 12, we've been hearing this promise from God come in many different forms. So it got me curious to see just how many times has God mentioned to Abraham and or Sarah that they were going to have a child. After diving in, I found that God promises a child to them, not just a few times, not several times, but between chapters 12 and 21, he promises them in various ways 30 times. Specifically, God told Abraham that he would have a son twice, have an heir once, have offspring twice, have many descendants 9 times, generations would come from him 3 times, that he would be the father of many nations 3 times, that kings would come from him once, that God would increase his numbers once, and that he would be very fruitful once. God also told Abraham that Sarah would have a son 5 times, that Sarah would be the mother of many nations once, and that kings would come from her once. This totals at least 30 times that God told Abraham directly or indirectly that he would have a son through whom Abraham would father many generations. All these reassurances to Abraham were spread out over 10 chapters, so I never put it together just how many times God told Abraham that he would indeed have a son. In chapter 18, we see God finally give some kind of timeline for his promise. If it was me, I would have been like, finally, thank you, Lord, for your promise and your faithfulness, and it's going to be fulfilled. And it would have been a done deal for me because in all of my years of relationship with God and all the things he's promised and fulfilled in my life, never has he once told me a specific timeline. But let's see what transpires here. Verse 10 says, then one of them said, I will return to you this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. Abraham and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, how could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such a pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also old? It seems at this point that Sarah had kind of just given up on what the Lord had promised to her in Abraham. We obviously saw in previous chapters that she had doubted God and even tried to take things into her own hands by having Hagar sleep with Abraham to bear him a child. And that didn't really go as she hoped either. She had probably reconciled in her heart that it would be okay if she never had a child of her own. I mean, I only battled infertility for 2 years and I pretty much reached that point. So I can't really cast blame or judgment on her, but let's look at what happens next. Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, can an old woman like me have a baby? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying, I didn't laugh. And here's my favorite line. But the Lord said, no, you did laugh. Ouch. That was one of those mic drop moments. God just straight up called her out right there for lying. No, you did laugh, Sarah. Why did Sarah just straight up lie to God? Well, she was afraid. Fear is the most common motivator for lying. We are afraid that our inner thoughts and emotions will be exposed or our wrongdoing discovered. Fear can make you do some really dumb things. And this kind of got me thinking, how many times have we tried to hide stuff from the Lord like he won't notice? Like he doesn't already know everything? He knows what we're hiding, so we might as well own up to it and just take it straight to him. And that mic drop moment is where that portion of chapter 18 abruptly ends. And now let's move on to verse 16. We see God contemplate whether or not he should tell Abraham of his plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, but ultimately he decides that he will. Verse 20 says, so the Lord told Abraham, I have heard a great outcry from Sodom and Gomorrah because their sin is so flagrant. I am going down to see if their actions are as wicked as I've heard, and if not, I want to know." Now, at this point, two of the men or the angels leave and head down towards Sodom, and God stays there with Abraham. In verse 23, Abraham asks God, "Will you sweep away both the righteous and the wicked?" This is where Abraham starts to intercede for Sodom. He starts by asking, "Suppose you find 50 righteous people living there in the city. Will you still sweep it away and not spare it for their sakes? Surely you wouldn't do such a thing, destroying the righteous along with the wicked. Why would you be treating the righteous and the wicked exactly the same? Surely you wouldn't do that. Should not the judge of all the earth do what is right?" Well, these are some pretty bold words from Abraham that he has with the Lord. But God agrees that if he finds 50 righteous people, he will not destroy the city. Next, Abraham says, "Since I've already begun," and kind of right here, he starts to schmooze a little bit and continues, "Let me speak further to my Lord, even though I am but dust and ashes." And then asks, "If there are only 45 righteous people, will you still spare the city?" God replies, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 righteous people there." And then Abraham drops all the compliments and just plainly asks, "What about 40 people?" And God agrees again. And then Abraham continues this from 40 to 30 to 20 down to just 10 righteous people. And each time God agrees. Now, I don't know about you, but as a parent, if one of my kids came to me after I had told them my plan and what we were going to do, and they proceeded not once and not twice, but 6 times to try to change my mind, I don't think I'd be as calm or merciful as God is here with Abraham. In fact, I can pretty much guarantee that I would snap back at them and bring correction to what I would probably feel as disrespected and argumentative behavior. And we'd probably be doing nothing that they wanted that day as a consequence of their action. But that's because I'm an imperfect human and God is not. Here we don't see Abraham necessarily being disrespectful or trying to undermine God's authority. He knows that God has to punish sin, but what he also knows is that God is merciful to sinners. It seems to me that he is questioning the Lord to see maybe just how merciful he can be. You see, at the end, Abraham leaves this conversation with God, convinced that God is both kind and fair. Abraham didn't change God's mind. God knew there wasn't 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, or even 10 righteous people in this entire city. But he was merciful enough to allow Abraham to intercede. And he was merciful enough to allow Lot and his family to get out of the city before it was destroyed. Now, there's a lot more I can get into this chapter, and it's really hard not to expand more, but I want to stop right here and wrap up with this last thought. With this conversation of intercession between God and Abraham, God showed Abraham and us that asking for anything is allowed, but it must come with the understanding that God's answers come from God's perspective. They don't always match up with our expectations because only God knows the whole story and sees the master plan. It challenges me with this. Am I missing God's better answer to prayer because I am only considering the answer that I want or expect? Are you missing God's better answer because you are only considering the answer that you want or expect? That's a hard question and a bit of an ouch thought. But if you can right now or sometime later today, I want to encourage you to take some time and reflect on that challenge.